in addition to the idea of looted cultural property as part of the field of art crime, we also have famous crimes. Probably nothing more famous in terms of the art heist. Now, this has a certain dark glamour to some, but of course, real damage can be done, especially if the artwork itself is damaged. Luckily, in this famous case of the theft of Mona Lisa from the Louvre, this didn't result in any damage to the painting itself. And in fact, it is viewed by some as almost an act of patriotism by the thief himself. So on the 21st of August, 1911, the Louvre employee Vincenzo Peruggia, he walked into the Louvre as a normal guest. He wasn't on duty that day. And he hid in a broom cupboard in time-honored fashion. When the museum closed, he came out of the cupboard, he took the Mona Lisa off the wall, and there were just 4 nails left on the wall. And then, in also time-honored fashion, he hid the painting under his coat and calmly walked out. For 2 years, Vincenzo had the Mona Lisa in his Paris apartment. And his argument was, and of course he was eventually caught, his argument was that he was acting from a matter of patriotism. He believed that the Mona Lisa belonged in Italy, and he said, I'm going to return it. He obviously had a little bit of fun with having the Mona Lisa there for 2 years. And of course, one of his very close friends was an expert forger. Well, he thought, if the Mona Lisa is no longer on view in the Louvre, where everyone can get to this priceless Italian artifact, then copies of this soon-to-be invisible object will be of more value. So his friend went about producing a series of copies, and then the thief goes off to Florence and calmly offers the painting to the Uffizi Gallery, whereupon the people in control think that perhaps they shouldn't take it on board. Obviously, it's not something that could ever be considered. And the security forces were called. The Louvre was communicated with. We have your painting. No damage, no significant damage had been done. And although Vincenzo did actually spend 6 months in prison, he was by many celebrated as a great patriot who had tried to do the right thing in repatriating this icon of Italian identity. However, there are many more heists that do result in the painting never being found or being found very damaged. And of course, as Vernon will tell you, this does incalculably more damage. So the third type of crime is the crime of forgery. Now, I just want to be clear here, the difference between fakes and forgeries. Fakes are not necessarily done to deceive. So you might make a fake Paul, a fake Rothko or a fake Paul Klee or whatever, anyone. And you won't necessarily tell the recipients that they are faked, but you won't also tell them that they're genuine. So faking is a kind of, if you like, a forgery light. Forgery is always done with the intention of deception. So a forgery is there to pass itself off as an original. Arguably the most famous case is that of Han van Meegeren, who was a very interesting character, not altogether savory character, and he is known as the Vermeer forger. He didn't just forge Vermeers, of course. Other Dutch artists of the Golden Age he forged. He had been a wannabe artist. He was technically proficient, but what he lacked was imagination. So he saw his chances and began to forge Vermeers and other artists of the Golden Age. And his great triumph in many ways was his ability to deceive the expert of Vermeers at the time in the Dutch museums, and he managed to convince him with the Supper of Emmaus, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen here. That was created in 1937, and the leading scholar of the day, the man who could tell the real from the imaginary was Abraham Bredius. And Bredius gave a absolutely beautiful summary of the genuine nature of this long undiscovered Vermeer. He would have got away with it if it hadn't been for his desire to sell a Vermeer to Goering, Hitler's deputy. And Goering swapped for his so-called Vermeer over 100 of other paintings that he had looted, and it was the pride of his place. If it hadn't been for the victory of the Allies, it might never have been discovered. However, Van Meegeren was questioned for collusion during the war. You've provided a Vermeer to Goering, of all people. How could you do such a thing? You know, there were significant consequences for this. And Van Meegeren, in order to get himself out of the predicament he found himself in, said, no, it was a forgery. You know, of course I wouldn't sell cultural property of that kind to Goering. And in fact, I've actually done you a favor. This is an act of subversion. The problem was nobody believed him. So in the picture on the left-hand side there, that photograph, you can see Van Meegeren being watched by people who were there to prosecute him, forging a Vermeer in front of them. Christ amongst the doctors. And this was the painting that basically got him off the hook. But who knows how many other forgeries have not yet been discovered. Some he owned up to straight away, but we never know the extent, and that's one of the problems with forgery, and it does do so much damage, as Vernon will go into. And of course, there's the huge matter of wholesale theft. And I've put the Holocaust era as the most exemplary way that we can see what has been done on a grand scale. This is not individual thefts, but this grand wholesale theft. And the photograph here shows a number of the works that have been gathered together. You can see, obviously, plenty of 15th century Netherlandish works there. Obviously, you know, the art historian's eye, I hope you can see plenty of works there. And this is obviously a concern that affects museums worldwide. The UK government, for example, I'm from the UK, has announced relatively recently that it would strengthen its commitment, in fact, indefinitely, to repatriate or rather return to its rightful descendants those works that were stolen through the situation of the Holocaust. And although that the commission for the return of this art was actually set up back in 2009, which is called the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act in the UK, this is now in action indefinitely. And in my long-distant past, I remember the co-convener, the co-lead of the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, a lady called Anne Weber, in the basement of the building I worked in London at the time, quietly working away on this incredibly important act of restitution that is ongoing. This is an open and current story. So wholesale theft is clearly a big issue. The smuggling of antiquities is my penultimate point. This has been going on forever. It will undoubtedly continue forever. So really the action is about the international community gathering together and trying at all points to stop this happening. It's apparently become even more of a problem during the pandemic as people have been away from work, sites have been much more loosely guarded. The pace itself of smuggling of antiquities, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, rich heritage sites, that problem has grown worse. And there's a very compelling arguments in the art press about what needs to be done in order to try and at least stem the hemorrhage of cultural artifacts in this way. So it's a matter of responsibility for everyone. And finally, a new kind of crime. In the wake of NFTs barely anyone had heard of them in 2020. Now you can't read a newspaper about the arts before you come across NFT. Non-fungible tokens. Where do I start? Very briefly. Non-fungible tokens are effectively the ticket that you present online to secure databases that is a series of alphanumeric codes that show that you are the owner of a digital artwork. It only exists in cyberspace. Anyone can see it. That's a very counterintuitive thing. But effectively, this image that is freely available to see, only one person can own it, or only a consortium of people can own it. So the token is that code that allows you to get in to check on your assets. And we had in some ways, there was a bit of schadenfreude when this happened. A gallery owner called Todd Kramer, just in December, the December just gone, had over $2 million worth of his assets stolen. And this was the theft of the Bored Ape Yacht Club non-fungible tokens. Non-fungible, by the way, means that it can't be replicated exactly. What is fungible? Cash is fungible. $1 bill looks like another dollar bill of the same currency. They are interchangeable and they do the same thing. Non-fungible means it's not replicable. So it's a unique object and the token is simply your ticket to prove ownership. So he was hacked and he had what the tech world, and which I don't fully understand, but I get it in principle, is called a hot wallet, which means that he basically kept plugged in all the time and left himself viable to hackers, unfortunately. And hackers get in through phishing scams, and he was hacked. And basically what looks to be the security here is to have what is called a cold wallet, which is like plugging something in, like a hard drive that you have as an external drive, so that you're not basically connected to that series of computers that's in the blockchain that is there to grant access, but also to confirm every single action that is taken in the history of the provenance, the ownership of this object. So if you think about the blockchain, it's much like a provenance record that says that a work painted in the 17th century belonged to this collection, that one, that one, that one, and you go on through and you see the history of the provenance, which of course is often full of holes. They go missing, they go into a private collection. Effectively, the blockchain will record every transaction, every change of ownership, everything that is done to that digital artwork. But it's not there yet, and of course the big thing that's happening now is the building of a much tighter security in order to prevent this very, very 21st century type of crime. So with that very brief introduction, I'd like to go across to Vernon Rapley, and as I said, he is the chief Director of Cultural Heritage and Protection and Security at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, former policeman at Scotland Yard Art Crime Squad, and he's going to tell us a lot more about this fascinating world that does far more harm than it appears from the outside.
Hello.
Hello, Vernon. Hello, lovely to have you here. So I've given that introduction. And over to you now with your fascinating and insightful tales of art crime at the coalface. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. What I'm going to talk to you about is some of the practical applications of art crime, how I have learned about art crime through my career in the police. So I was 24 years at Scotland Yard, and the last 10 as the head of the Art and Antiques unit there, along with various other teams, such as working with 4 or 5 Interpol tracking task forces for different areas of art crime and illicit smuggling of cultural goods. So probably I've interviewed as many, if not more, art criminals than anyone else in the world. And I've sometimes spent up to 20 hours interviewing art criminals, trying to understand not only everything they've done, but also why they've done it. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about how I transfer that knowledge and that experience into the practical use of defending the world's cultural heritage, or in my case, the Victoria and Albert Museum's objects and collections from attack from art crime. So I'm going to try and share my slides with you. As you can see, I'm quite old, so it may not work, but has it worked? I think I can see it up on the screen there. So we're going to go through. So as I've said, my career is one very much in two halves. My first half as a Scotland Yard detective, and my second half as a museum director charged with global cultural heritage protection, very specifically looking after our museum collections. And I when I first joined the museum, I picked Trajan's column, which sits in our amazing cast courts at the museum, as an object that I reflected in. And I see this object as symbolic of my life in some ways, that it's a story, the story of Trajan's Dacian campaigns broken in two parts. It's broken in two parts, of course, in the V&A, and it makes it much easier to see and look at than the original in the Forum in Rome. And in many ways, I see my life as being broken very much into two parts that are not commonly seen by many people. So what I'm going to look today is how we learn from the past, but also how we look beyond the headlines. And the crimes that you've just heard about are hugely important to us, and there's a lot we can learn, but also there's a lot of smaller art crimes that are actually probably more dangerous to the day-to-day management of our collections and safeguarding. And I'll take you through some of those actual real case studies, some of the cases that we dealt with whilst I was at the Yard. I'm going to describe the real impact that art crime can have on collections, and how it is absolutely better to protect ourselves than to solve the problem later. No museum in the world is happy to recover artworks. We genuinely don't want to lose them in the first place. While they're lost to us, not only are they lost to our visitors and people who want to learn from them, but there's a very high risk that they're damaged and badly treated whilst not in our care. I'm going to learn from personal experience, and I'll give you some actual art crimes that took place at the Victoria and Albert Museum that were solved whilst I was a police officer. Thankfully, and I'm touching wood here, as we say in England, we haven't had any major art crimes since in the 10 years or 11 years now that I've been at the Victoria and Albert Museum. We're then going to look at understanding the risks and opportunities that we have, and then a quick look towards the future and how we can protect ourselves using modern technology. So first of all, you'll see some of the pictures Liv's just put up here. There is a huge amount that we can learn as museums from art crimes of the past, but we must also remember that art criminals, like any other criminal, move with the times. The reasons that they commit crimes changes, their motivation changes, and their methods change. And you've just heard there about non-fungible tokens, which is something, of course, that didn't exist in 1911 when the Mona Lisa was stolen. So art criminals are like no other, are like all others, sorry. They change and they adapt and they seize opportunities as they can. So we can learn from the past, but it's really important that we bring ourselves up to date and we look globally at what's happening. And if we look in the last few years at the sort of art crimes that are affecting museums, we see time after time the targeting of high value materials, not high value art, very distinctive difference here, but high value material. It may be art, it may be in a museum, but the reason that it's being stolen is because it can be sold as gold. This is a 50 kilo gold coin that was stolen from the Bode Museum in Berlin. We then look at the green vaults in Dresden, and we see a lot of high value metal, a lot of pearls and a lot of diamonds that can easily be broken down and sold in parts. And this is a trend that is happening for the last 4 or 5 years across museums across the world. And it's a way that museums need to look differently at what we protect. It's not necessarily our most treasured objects. It's the objects that can be most easily used by criminals. In other words, moved from being objects into being money. In the whole of my time investigating art crime and being involved with art criminals, I never once met an art criminal who collected art. They all had another reason for that art. They either used it to trade for other criminal products, they used it as collateral, they used it sometimes even as a get out of jail free card, or most commonly they sold it and used it just for straightforward commercial profit. But that's not forgetting that as well as high value materials, there are also attempts to steal high value art as well. And there have been several, especially in Holland, the Netherlands, and in the Scandinavian countries, and in London as well, where high value masterpieces are still targeted by criminals. And so we can't take our eye off of that risk as well. But what I want to do today is to look beyond the headlines, look beyond those very high value media appealing cases, and look at some cases that involve people that you probably will never heard of, like this man here, who was a trained conservator of paper. He was trusted with high value collections. He was left alone with high value collections, and yet for years he was stealing from those collections and supplementing his own collection or selling those objects. And he was operating out of a number of libraries within the United Kingdom, some of whom didn't check the material for many, many years after it was seen, because people just don't borrow the books that often. It's as simple as that. When we're talking about books and pages, sometimes people don't realize that some of these books can be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds as a single book. And when you have unhindered access to these objects day after day for years, you can make a very substantial profit from stealing something as simple as a book. Another man who did virtually the same was this guy who targeted the British Library. He was actually a world expert in these objects, and therefore was entitled and allowed to borrow very high value objects. He was removing pages from these books and inserting them into his own copy of the books to increase the value of his book. And again, he did this year after year after year. And the common thread you'll see with both of these is that they had trust. People trusted them. One was a trained conservator. The second one was a leading authority or expert. We look at another one, and I've just picked three here that all steal pages from books by coincidence. These two went around Europe stealing very valuable pages, maps from ancient map books, 15th, 16th, 17th century map books from around Europe. Now, they weren't art experts, they weren't trained conservators, so how did they get trust? How did they build trust in the libraries they went to, which is the only way that they would be allowed to get these very high value books? Well, they used a very simple technique. Every time they went into a library, they pretended they'd found some high value notes on the floor, maybe $50 notes, and they'd hand them into the librarian, and they would say, oh, look, I think maybe a student has been sitting here and they've dropped all these notes, and I wouldn't want them to lose their money. I wonder if you can try and get it back to them. And what's the librarian thinking? The librarian's thinking, what a very honest person this is. So the next time when they came in, they remembered them, but they remembered them as being a very honest person. So when they asked for high value books, that they weren't in any way suspicious, and this gave them the access they needed to commit crimes across Europe, costing millions and millions of pounds. But most importantly, the total destruction of the books that they took these pages out of. Only about 5% of the maps they stole could ever be positively identified and returned to the libraries in question. Now, Viv spoke earlier about the risk of forgeries. There's a very real risk of forgeries. The risk is not rarely the forged object, the forged painting getting into a museum, although that absolutely happened with one of the famous cases I investigated, which was Sean Greenhouse, who managed to get forged objects into a number of museums. But actually the biggest risk is the false provenance, the false history, the documentation that surrounds the object. So in this case, a con artist, a fraudster, and an artist got together. The artist created paintings. You can see down here a crucifixion scene by artist Graham Sutherland, or appearing to be by that. That's created by the artist, but the clever work is committed by the con artist. The con artist leaves clues on the back of the artwork, and you can see the rear of the artwork there with a handwritten label and a library stamp. That library stamp, to anyone researching that object, will lead them to an archive. In this case, an archive of the Order of St Mary's Servite, which existed within the V&A. That allowed the con artist to go ahead of the sale of this painting and insert false provenance into that archive. In other words, he created, by taking photographs of the objects and creating false sales receipts, etc., proof that that object existed in the 1960s. He then inserted it into the archive so that months or even years later, when the painting is produced and an art historian takes that, conducts that research, it will lead them to the reputable archive of the V&A or the Tate or the Royal College of Art. And in there, they will find the indisputable proof that that object is real. And that's what commits the fraud and allows them to sell the painting as genuine. The real risk here, of course, is that the archive of the institution, whether it be a library or a museum, is corrupted forever. And no one will ever really know what is real and what isn't real within some of these archives because of the damage done by people like this. So prevention is better than cure. And now this is what I was saying earlier, where we absolutely don't want to lose material. And sometimes it's because it's very, very hard to get it back, because the art world, the auction houses, the dealers have a different standard sometimes to a suspicious, nasty, horrible old policeman such as myself. They will sell things because they can be sold. They don't question everybody. They presume that people selling art are nice, genuine people. I presume that everyone I meet is a criminal, but that's a different matter. So this, for example, is something that came out of a library. You can see there, to me, it's suspicious. Why has it got a blue sticker and a big black flower drawn in the corner? Well, they're to conceal the marks underneath, and the marks underneath take that back to a library. This is another object. This is a very old book from Poland. And you can see here that the things that make it unique and identifiable have been cut out with a scalpel. You can see they're under the title. You can see inscriptions at the side. These are what make it unique. These are what make it identifiable. And you can see how they're cut out of the book so that the book can be sold. Now, to me, this is very little different to someone trying to sell a car with the engine number removed, the chassis number removed, and in fact, the registration number removed. But these things happen in the art trade, and it's why it's incredibly difficult to recover all of the items that are lost. And so it's absolutely imperative that museums and collections around the world prevent the theft rather than try and find a cure for it afterwards. So learning from experience, I wanted to show you a couple of real cases. I have blacked their faces out just to protect their identity, even though they're as guilty as sin. But a couple of real cases just to demonstrate sometimes how simple art crime can be. And in this case, this guy walked in as a visitor during daylight hours. Sorry, I'm getting some sort of music. Oh, is that gone? Sorry. Suddenly got a burst of music appear in my ears. I'm not sure what was happening. So this guy came into the museum as a visitor. He came in wearing a flat hat, a tweed jacket, dark trousers, and what looked like a white shirt underneath. The only thing he had was a plastic bag in his pocket. Other than that, he carried nothing. He went into the galleries of the museum. They're free to walk around, and he walked straight up to the painting you can see on the picture there. It's a very small painting. It's by John Linnell. The painting is worth maybe $100,000 or something along those lines, but it's no larger than this. He put the plastic bag over the painting, and he pulled it straight off the wall. Now, it's really important for museums that occasionally it's not we want people to steal them. That's absolutely the wrong thing. We would rather they took the object than destroyed the object. So objects are not always fixed to the wall really robustly. They're fixed to the wall in a way that does allow them to be removed before they're destroyed, in the hope that other security defences will work. In this case, in those days, and this was quite some time ago, there were no other defences, and this painting was very easy for him to pull off. He left the scene. He went to the toilets of the museum. He took the painting, which was already in the bag. He took his jacket off and he took his hat off, and giving him a very, very different appearance. Underneath there, he was wearing a short-sleeved England football shirt. He had tattooed sleeves and he had very short hair, as you can see. A completely different description, if you were looking for him, than the one he came in. And he walked straight out the door. Now, on this occasion, this was when I was in the police, we did recover this painting, and we recovered it with the help of the art trade. We recovered it with the help of one of the major auction houses, who did identify it when it was sold. The second time it was sold, it went to an auction house. They identified it. It was being sold as a Victorian painting, but it was identified by them as a painting by John Linnell. They looked it up, saw it was from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they contacted myself in the police, and we recovered it and arrested the man, who we had arrested, incidentally, about 5 or 6 times already for other crimes against museums. It was his job. He did nothing else. He was so much of an art criminal that on one occasion when he was released from prison, we thought we would follow him because we didn't know where he was going to live. And we thought, well, we're probably going to have to arrest him again within a few months. So we'll follow him home, get his address, and then that way, if we need to go and arrest him again in the future, we'll be able to. He came out of prison and we had a whole surveillance team waiting for him. He got on a bus. He wasn't met by anyone. Got on a bus. He caught the bus to a museum. He went inside and he burgled the museum. And he was instantly arrested. He didn't even get home. We still didn't know where he lived at the end of that event. So they're the sort of people you're dealing with. These are not clever criminals. They're not sophisticated. This guy, like many others, committed crimes to order for other people. And here's another. This is a painting that hung in a private part of the museum. And I want to demonstrate the impact of this crime because this is the museum and you can still see it. It's about to be repainted now. And this is probably 15 years later. You can see the marks on the walls where there is a number of paintings. Now, he only stole one painting. He worked for the museum as a caterer. And in those days, there was no real checks about people to make sure that they were honest before they were employed in things like the catering department. He came out one day, he saw the painting, he pulled it off the wall and he walked out the museum with it. I won't go into how he got out of the museum. He certainly shouldn't have been able to, and he certainly wouldn't be able to nowadays, but he could then. So why am I using this? This is a very simple art crime committed by an in-house agent, and he steals one painting that's not massively valuable, maybe $40,000 or $50,000. It's a painting by William Etty. Well, the impact of this was that in this part of the museum, these stairs go up five stories. Beautiful old staircase and decorated throughout by 240 paintings. All British paintings, no room in the rest of the museum for these paintings. They weren't on public display, but they were here so that staff and students and experts could come by appointment and see these paintings hung on walls in the way that they should be seen. They were in a private part of the museum because this area wasn't deemed to be suitable for the public, and the museum didn't have enough money to alarm and cover this area with CCTV. So the impact of this crime was that all 240 or 230 paintings were taken down and have never gone back on public display because the museum didn't have and doesn't have the money to put them back in a way that's safe. Now, this was one of the first crimes that we were able to produce something called an impact statement to the court, because we didn't want the court to be judging this man on his actions purely that he'd stolen a painting and that we had recovered the painting. We did recover the painting following a police raid on his house where we also recovered firearms and various other things. The painting was returned with very minor damage that could easily be repaired. But the impact of his crime is the loss of all of these paintings for generations of students of British art. And this is the first time in court that we were able to convince the judge that he should sentence him accordingly and take that into consideration. Very much what we tried to do when I was in the police is to convince judges and juries that Hollywood's glamorous perception of art crime is nothing of the sort. These people are not clever, educated art criminals. They are just criminals who cause a huge amount of damage to our collections worldwide. So looking now at how we understand the risks and what opportunities we have, well, in museums, we share a lot of intelligence. We share information with various different groups. And Viv mentioned ICOM earlier. I happen to be on the chair of the board of ICMS, which is the Security Committee for ICOM. I also run something called the SOM Group, which is European Security, and I'm the chair and founder of the National Museum Security Group and various other groups. But regardless of that, all of these groups work together. We all share information because we're not competitors. We're not like supermarkets. We're not even like auction houses. We like each other. We work with each other, and what helps us helps other people. And so it's a great environment to work for that. We also have a really good relationship with our colleagues in the police, the intelligence services, and other security departments. And that gives us information. It gives us really critical information. It means that we can build a pattern up of who and what we're likely to be affected by. So this is a really good piece of research that was done by a team called the Opal team, which looks at crime across England and Wales. And it tells us that rural venues are more likely to be attacked, that offences are concentrated in the southeast of England, that offenders using new ways to avoid detection. One of the new ways that they're using very commonly is they're using drones now as a way of scouting out the security defences of the buildings, whether they be estates, country houses, or museums or libraries that they're going to target. They use all sorts of technology rather than put themselves at risk by going there. The thing that they're stealing determines how they steal it. Now, this might sound really like common sense, but actually, criminals accept a lot of loss. They will steal very fragile, very valuable things from our collections. They don't really care how much of it they break, as long as they get away with enough for their purposes. And so, again, we have to be very, very careful of how we protect our objects, because we're not protecting them from theft by people who care about them. And a really good example of this is the prevalence of bronze theft within the world, actually, but it's very highly reported in America, UK, and Europe. Bronze statues are being stolen, and they're being stolen purely because of their metal, their value as metal. That means that they're stolen in a different way. And whereas we might look at a big Henry Moore sculpture and think, well, to steal that, you're going to have to unbolt it from the bottom, you're going to have a crane to lift it up and put it on. That's not how a criminal looks at it. What a criminal looks at and thinks, that's a big chunk of metal. I'll tie a chain around it, I'll drag it off the plinth, and I'll drag it down the road. They're not worried about damaging it or virtually destroying it. All they're interested in is, can they get the lump of metal to the scrapyards to get the money? Now, that means that we have to protect our objects in a very different way than if we're dealing with them when people are stealing them because they're objects. High value metal and jewels are the most desirable to offenders at the moment. We discussed that earlier. Offenders like dark evenings and night. Now that's changed, it shifts, and it's really important to understand the difference. 10 or 12 years ago, most museum thefts happened during daylight hours. They happened, as I described earlier, by the guy who just walked in as a visitor. It was easy to do because museums didn't have the same level of CCTV. They didn't invest in the same levels of security. And so it was perceived as a weakness. Why break in at night, risking setting off alarms and having to cut through doors and gates, when you can just walk in as a visitor during the day? Now, it's a really good sign to me that's changed and that offenders are now operating at night, because it means that our daytime security has at least increased. And generally, art crime is decreasing. The numbers of major offences against art are decreasing over the years as galleries, museums, owners and collections invest more and more in security. Obviously, offenders are encouraged by poor physical or technical security measures. This isn't about its capability, it's about a perception. It's really important that we give the impression that we care about our objects, that we care about our collections. It's not just about having security in the corner, it's actually about things like, is the gallery clean? Is it dusted? I mean, all of these things actually lead a criminal to think that you care about your objects, and therefore they presume the level of security is really high. I interviewed a really interesting art thief years ago who had been to 5 different houses to burgle small miniature paintings. That was his target. He needed them because someone had commissioned him. He went to a number of what we call national trust houses. They're houses owned by the nation, and they're largely staffed by volunteers. And these volunteers are mostly ladies over the age of 50. So they're not the most formidable line of security, but this art criminal wouldn't go near them. He would not burgle any of those. Why not? Well, because every time he walked in there to see what there was, a lady came up to him and asked him, "Hello, how are you? What are you doing here today? How did you get here? Have you got any family? Why are you interested in these?" Now, this isn't security, but it terrified the art criminal because they've been identified, they've been noticed, and that's absolutely what they don't want that to happen. So that was far more intimidating to an art criminal than a heavily armed security guard standing in the corner with their arms crossed staring at you when you walk into the gallery. That didn't trouble them at all because they knew they could be easily distracted. They knew they could just work through when they weren't on that beat. And if you look at things like the theft of the Rothko from the Tate a few years ago, they simply waited for the security guard to leave one room, go into another, and then they destroyed or damaged the Rothko painting. So really, really interesting when you talk to art criminals to understand how this happens. Most offenders conduct HR, which is hostile reconnaissance, using OS, sorry for all the police terminology here, open source information. So in other words, they go online and they get a lot of the information they need about where the objects, what objects they want to steal, where the objects are. And nowadays they can go in and they can usually see what sort of security we've got, where we've got cameras and things like that. Certainly lighting, doors and things like that. Most offenders then conduct hostile reconnaissance on site shortly before. I won't go into the last one, which is the statistics of how they do it. What I wanted to do was to say how we take all of this sort of information that comes up, not all specific to us, but very much the things we need to be aware of, and we identify where our best opportunities are to defeat art criminals. And you can see here a sort of timeline of how an attack might occur. The black line in the middle shows that everything to the left, as I'm looking at the screen, is not at the museum or the gallery or the library, but is conducted remotely. And everything on the right is at the museum. You can see the progress there. So to start with, very little opportunity around general research. If you want to steal Chinese jade objects, well, you can look on the internet and find out which museum has them. But when you start to search for Chinese jade objects on our website, there is an opportunity for the museum to identify abnormal patterns of behaviour and to start to trigger alerts within the museum, especially if it's matched by intelligence from the police or other people that say you should be particularly wary of attacks of this sort of material, which is hopefully what we get. Then they will go into hostile reconnaissance of our site remotely. That means that they then start to look at, okay, the museum has got this material that I want to steal. How do I steal it? And they start to search things within our website that tells them about our security, our defences, our hours of opening, our cameras, our events, all of these things that might give them an opportunity. Then they possibly will do hostile reconnaissance using technical means. That means if they need specific information, like how is our roof protected, they might fly a drone over our roof. And again, this gives us an opportunity. I've shown that in amber. Drones in London are very highly regulated. When a drone flies over, the police let us know, and we can look at where its flight path is, or the police can, and examine whether or not it's suspicious. So all of these things give us opportunities. But for us, we have identified the best opportunities when the criminal first comes to sight. You will see at the far right, when they are stealing, the attack, the getaway, and the realization of assets, there are, of course, opportunities there, but they're far more for the police. At the point of attack, very limited, actually. We need to have done our work beforehand. The best thing we can do is to put them off when they come to visit us. When they come to visit us with hostile intent, when they come to visit us to see whether or not they can get to the object, how good our security is, that's when we should do it. So that's the hostile reconnaissance in person and the penetration testing. And those three areas of red is where we focus the majority of our effort and attention. So I'm just giving an example here. This is my museum, Victoria and Albert Museum. It's the most beautiful and best museum in the world. So there we go, I won't say any more on that. But we've also got museums all over the place, including in China, in Scotland. We're building 2 in East London. We've got sites in West London and a couple of other sites down in other places within the UK as well. And we have a very long tradition of rigid security. And you'll see there in the right-hand side, a police officer in our galleries. Now, we still, if you work at the Victoria and Albert Museum as a gallery assistant, you're given a beat. And a beat is a hangover from the Metropolitan Police, because the museum was patrolled for nearly 80 years by the police. We didn't have gallery assistants or privately employed people. The police, and you can see them there outside the original guard hut, patrolled our museum and looked after our objects. And their position was very much high visibility, uniformed, wearing their helmets, protecting the objects. Even when the police left, the museum guards adopted the same uniform and the same stance. This idea that you stand and stare and make people feel uncomfortable, really, and observe people so that they won't do you any harm. But we looked at what we want to do in the future. We looked at how we want to welcome our visitors. We want an empathetic security response. We want something that supports our mission, which in our mission is to bring people in and to let people enjoy these objects. And we looked at some really good examples in Holland at the Rijksmuseum, the Van Gogh Museum, about how they operated security more intelligently and in a more focused way. And we then train our staff and move our staff in that direction. And this is about really understanding the risks that you face. It's a very complex, this is not the risk assessment. There is a very long, complex document that tells us all of our risks and where our opportunities to address those risks come. The interesting thing here, that when you look statistically across the world, this figure is pretty reliable. 1 in 11.5 million visitors come to a museum with the intention of stealing an object. Now, of course, that's not totally reliable. You might have 2 who turn up, 50 visitors apart. But that's the level of crime you're talking about. The Victoria and Albert Museum has 3 to 3.5 million visitors a year. That means we might have 1 visitor every 3 years who comes with the intention of stealing an object statistically. So with that in mind, we looked at what is our basic security. Our basic security was we search everyone's bag when they enter the Victoria and Albert Museum, or we used to. What was that achieving? We were searching about 2 to 2.5 million bags a year, and we never found anything that would have been used to commit an art crime or damage, or actually of anything of real concern. And the vast majority of people who presented their bags for searching were perfectly law-abiding people. When you looked at how art criminals operate, you understand that not one of them brings the material they need to steal a painting in a bag with them during daylight opening hours. And therefore, there was really not much point from an art theft perspective in searching bags. Of course, there are other reasons that we might be concerned about, like counterterrorism. So we introduced a team called the Behavioural Detection Officers, and they look not for things, but they look at abnormal behaviour in visitors. And what they're looking for is people conducting that hostile reconnaissance that I described in that previous slide. They're looking for people who are acting abnormally because they're not coming to visit our objects, they're coming to see how they can steal them. And they're the most important people to us. They're a soft approach, they are customer focused, they are harking back to some of the ideas I said about the volunteers and the National Trust housing. They talk to people. They talk to people, and in my opinion, they discourage people from committing crimes because they give a strong impression that we are caring for our objects. Of course, we have to secure everything in the normal way, and any museum knows that you need to build up layers of defence. So you can't just rely on people, because our behavioural detection officers are ineffective at night because there are no visitors, therefore there is no abnormal behaviour. So, of course, you need to support it with a physical barriers, strong cases, alarms, technical security, biometric access control, all of these things, good quality CCTV that can home in and be intelligent and look and protect you in areas of vulnerability. But all of that is there only to support what is fundamentally your primary objective, which is to try and deter people at their early stages from committing art crime. Now, whether that's art crime in your library, as we looked at a lot of thieves there who were stealing books and pages, the behavioural detection officers work really well in there, but so does really good procedures amongst librarians of checking books when they come in and out, and most importantly, talking to people. Then with the technology, we're also looking at making it more intelligent. CCTV and alarms. An alarm tells you hopefully when something's happening, or if not, when it's just happened. And CCTV gives you the evidence of what has happened. Now, if we go back, I remember me saying that prevention is better than cure. Now, CCTV and alarms rarely actually prevent crime. But there is a way that they can, and that's if they're used intelligently. And so what we're looking at is things like advanced analytics that will start to detect abnormal behavior through the cameras and trigger alerts, which will allow us to deploy people to assess the situation. We're also using something, or we're trialing something called gesture analytics, which is a way that members of the public or staff that don't have radios can attract the attention of security by making a sign at any one of our cameras. So the cameras are dormant. I mean, most venues, we have 880 cameras, but I only have 3 or 4 people watching them. So therefore, you can wave at a camera for quite a long time before anyone's likely to see you, but not if the camera identifies that the person in front of it is trying to attract its attention. Then it switches that camera on in the control room, and that means we can bring assistance to them. That means we can quadruple the size of our security team by engaging all of our staff and potentially even our visitors in there. We're also trying to find benefits from our security cameras for the rest of the museum. Like, we can now assess object damage really, really efficiently. We used to rely upon people saying, well, that object's been touched, and they fill a form in and they send it to the curator. And the curator would look at an object and think, oh, that object's been touched about 20, 30 times this year. So maybe in 3 or 4 years, we'll have to give it a clean, or we'll rotate it around. By using intelligent CCTV, we could tell them that some of these objects were being touched 1,200 times a month rather than 20 or 30 times a year. Now, that's not to say that they can't display that object or they have to protect it, but it does mean that they can make an informed decision about how they deal with that object and whether or not it needs conserving, protecting, or cleaning more often. So that's really all I was going to say. My design today really was to try and demonstrate how a knowledge of art crime and a knowledge of those who commit art crime can be used and applied to protect the cultural heritage of the world for generations to come. So I welcome any questions if there's time.
Thank you very much, Vernon. Fascinating to actually see from the inside how you go about mitigating the potential damage that can be done. And also, I think it came across really clearly about the insidious nature of some of the crimes that you described. And I think what particularly resonated with me is the idea of archives being destroyed so that it can never be fully undone, and also the betrayal of students and of people to enjoy art, which is ultimately what it's all about, being taken away by one person's action that denied access to so many countless others. I'm going to just throw any questions open to the audience in front of me here to see if there are anything that anyone wants to ask. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, because there is this impression that it is a victimless crime, oftentimes, right, art crime. But aside from the fact that, you know, as the example you gave of the private section of the museum, that you're essentially robbing people, forgive me, robbing people of the right to see it in the future, that with the impact statement. But other than that, has there been any incidents where it also comes with violence, for example?
Okay.
Or, you know, bodily harm in any kind of way?
Okay. Vernon, did you hear the whole question, or do I need to repeat?
I only heard the last bit, and I think unless there was another bit, does art crime involve violence, or can it? Was there more to it than that?
That's essentially it. The portrayal of it being a victimless crime, and apart from the incidents we've been discussing tonight, but are there any occasions that you've dealt with where there is a victim of physical damage to the person?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And never a victimless crime. There's always a victim because someone's been stolen. But is there physical injury? Was there risk of physical injury? Absolutely, there is. And that applies both in daytime attacks and in nighttime attacks. And the risk is that your staff are there to protect those objects, and they have that's their job, to protect those objects. The people coming in are they're criminals, and they are often paid to commit those crimes. And that means that they will, and they have on many occasions, use violence if it's necessary. So there have been numerous occasions where night security officers have been attacked or tied up. There have been occasions in Europe with the theft of rhinoceros horn, where people have been sprayed with CS gas. There are other occasions now with the sort of decolonialization question, where people feel they have the right not only to remove the objects, but also to commit crimes of violence in order to get to those objects, because they feel they have the right to do it. So it's absolutely, it is a risk, and it's a very serious concern. We do have armed robberies as well, although they have been more in the past and in Europe. Firearms, thankfully, in the UK are still quite slim. But in Europe and America, that's quite common. These are very, very high value crimes, and people will do extreme things for high value crimes. And if I could just give you an idea of one criminal we were looking to arrest, he had been commissioned to commit a crime. His crime was he was designed to drop down through the roof of a museum, where it was accepted that he would probably break his legs. He was then charged really with enabling the release of a mechanism which would release a painting so it could be stolen. He was then to lie there and be arrested. So he was going to suffer probably 2 broken legs, and he was going to be arrested and probably in prison for 3 or 4 years. I'll ask the question, how much do you think that criminal wanted to put himself in that position? So the answer, because I won't be able to hear you if you say anything, is £5,000. That's all that criminal wanted. So these are desperate people in a high value game who will commit all sorts of crimes and violence to perpetrate these offences.
Which leads to the obvious question. You've talked a lot about people stealing to order. How often do you get to the source of the problem? In other words, the people who are ordering the crimes.
Yeah, commonly, and I can't discuss individual people, but of course that's always the objective. The same with it's probably less so in art crime than it is in looting. We know that the people who loot from archaeological sites in Syria and Iraq and various other places, these are not the people that the world is after. We're after the people who are commissioning those crimes, selling them and making huge amounts of money. And it's exactly the same in the art world. Of course, we have to start with the person who is dropping in through the museum roof. But the target of the police will always be those that are commissioning those crimes and benefiting from them, with an intention not only to recover the art, but to recover any assets and to prevent further crime. So it's common that it's not just the arts thief himself who is arrested.
Any other questions? Yes, Abir. Do we have the... Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, hi, Vernon. Thank you so much for the lovely lecture. And it's just quite amazing information. I just want to ask, you said something about how some of the paintings are taken as part of big gangs and their dealings. And so what do they exactly do? Do you have any examples of like paintings have been used that? And my other thing is, there are very, very famous paintings that have been stolen, maybe just like the Gardner Museum, for example, in America, or in Egypt, the Van Gogh that disappeared. And those ones were not going to be sold again. So do you have a theory of what would the people do with them, the people who stole them?
Okay. I mean, the Gardner Museum, I have to be careful here. Information I had in the police, I'm not allowed to let you know. I don't think that was stolen, never to be seen again. I think it was stolen. They were stolen by an organised criminal gang, and I think there was a purpose to it. What you sometimes have to remember is that that purpose gets lost. So there was the IRA, a terrorist organisation, Ireland and England during the dispute, used art crime very commonly. There was quite a good example at Rossborough House, where Gainsborough was stolen, I think, 3 times by the IRA. And other paintings stolen by the IRA were held with the intention of being used as bargaining chips to reduce their sentence or to get major members of that organisation out of crime. Now, I know of one painting that was stolen, very high value, put in a plastic dustbin, buried in a peat bog in Ireland. Only 2 people knew where that was. Both of them were killed. So we know that there is a painting in a plastic bin in Ireland. We don't know where it is, and we don't believe anyone else alive knows that either. The mafia have used this as well, the nativity scene, the Caravaggio nativity scene. You can read all about this online or in books. Very likely stolen by them for similar purposes to the IRA. The rumour is it was then stored in a pig shed and probably eaten by pigs. So a lot of it is damaged, and this is what we're going back to with the thing. They keep it with the intention of using it at a later stage. In other words, they can hand it back in order to get their sentence reduced or to get some sort of favourable conditions when they get in trouble for something else. But it's incredibly difficult once it's in that period, because you don't really know who within the organisation, if anyone, still knows where those paintings are.
Thank you. Yes, we have another question.
Thank you so much for our presenter today and our guests. I really enjoyed my time and the information given. I have one question about the museums and libraries in the UK. Do you think that the government is giving the support, especially financially, regarding the art crimes, regarding fighting the art crimes, and how much is the the balanced support that could be given by any government?
Okay, that's a tricky question, as I'm fundamentally a civil servant. But nothing is ever enough, is it? I think the importance here is that you can do a lot in different ways, and it's not all about money. It's about, as I've said at the V&A, it's about changing and focusing your efforts on what's really important to achieve a goal, rather than trying to hit specific standards. So, standards are sometimes useful. Standard of glass, a standard of wall or door or lock. These are useful guides, but actually what you need to do is understand really where that risk is coming from, and then focus your attention and your efforts and your money in that area. The short answer is that I feel, certainly from my museum, that we are adequately funded. I would love for someone to give me an extra £10 million a year. I could put it to very good use, but I also feel that we're providing a proportionate level of security. And I think that will be true for most of the national museums within the UK. They're museums that receive some funding from government. That's not the case for some smaller privately run museums that have really important collections or in the care of local authorities who rely heavily on the money of visitors. In other words, admission fees or exhibition tickets. Now, of course, we rely on that as well, but not to the same extent of those local museums. And the pandemic in particular and the drop of visitor numbers will have caused significant financial holes in their budgets. And we have to be very careful that security is prioritised within those budget plans. And that's a very hard thing to do because it's not the primary purpose of a museum. What it is to get people in and get them enjoying things and seeing things. And that's, of course, where they want to put the money. But primarily, we need to make sure they're still there for the next generation. And so that's why it's important that those that money is looked at. But from a national perspective and from a government funding perspective, I don't have a complaint about the level of funding at the moment.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, in the corner.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm sorry, my question is a bit outside of the art crime subject. Regarding CCTV, is there any noticeable observer patterns?
I'm not sure what you mean by observer patterns.
Observer as in the person observing a painting or an artifact like the Gummer Patch concept. People who come and look and walk through the corridors and get affected by the art. Because I've noticed that you've explained how the CCTV analyzes gestures and movements. Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah. So we're working on the gesture analytics. That's not in place at the moment. I think what we are asking? I'm sorry, I'm finding it a little hard to hear. Is would someone looking at CCTV for sinister purposes be triggered by the CCTV alarm? One would absolutely hope that, but we would also hope that this is one of the things that our staff are trained to look for as well. Is people that I'm terrible because whenever I go to a museum, I look at the art. Of course, I love art, but I also look at the alarms and the CCTV, and I get picked out by quite a lot of security teams because I'm paying far too much attention to those things. So it's a very important thing. I don't know if I've answered your question or not because I did struggle to hear it fully. But is that right?
You've answered another question. That's
okay.
I think the guest was asking, what might be the gestures? So you've already answered,
right.
Looking too closely at the kind of security
noticeable
measures.
Patterns.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yes. The gesture. Yeah, I'll tell you, one of the things that we have succeeded at doing, and we haven't got it in place yet, but we know it works, is our cameras can now tell whether someone is in a wheelchair or not within the museum. Now, that might sound, well, what use is that? But actually, from a safety perspective, it's really useful for us to know where people with wheelchairs are in the museum. So if we have a fire, we can identify them and bring them down. We are now working on a pattern where when you look at a shop, commonly, this is where the technology and the science comes from, people move around a shop in a particular way, in a particular direction. And we're trying to work out whether people do the same in museums. In other words, do they always go left of here, right of there? Do they go here first and then to something else? And if we can identify the normal pattern, then the computer will allow us to identify abnormal patterns. And that might include people who are spending too long in front of emergency exits or looking at cameras or looking at bits of the wall that don't have art on them. So all of these things can and we are looking at how we develop them. But to get that, you need a baseline, and security in museums is difficult because if you look at airport security where this does work, there's a process. Everyone does the same thing in the same order. And it's a process from arriving at the airport, parking your car, going through various different places and ending up on the aeroplane. Museums aren't like that. You might choose to come in, you might go to the shop, you might go to the cafe, then you might wander around one gallery, then another. So we're looking at it in a lot more detail about how people interact with objects and how long they spend with objects and how much they spend in each sort of area or zone, and then seeing if we can trigger identifiers that will allow us to do nothing more than to send someone there to see if they're okay. We think at the moment we'll be able to tell whether people are lost. Now that's quite interesting as well, because from a customer perspective, if you're lost in our museum, and that's quite easy, there's 7 miles of museum, we'll be able to send someone there to help you. So it might not be a direct security intervention, but it might well be a very useful thing for museums to do as well.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Vernon. I don't see any more questions. Anyone else? And I'm sorry to hear that you often get accosted for looking far too closely at cameras. You've obviously spent far too long in the criminal world. But I mean, really fascinating insight there, Vernon. And I think, you know, every visitor here, something we all passionately care about, which is those intangible assets, that cultural heritage that give us so much pleasure and make life so much richer. And we don't want anyone taking those riches from us. So thank you again very much for being with us today and for giving some insight as to the changing nature of art crime and the solutions to counter it.